Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's retro seminar. My name's Alan Morrison. I'm the Intesa San Paolo Professor of Business Ethics and Finance at the Side Business School in Oxford, and I'm joined today by Rita Motta, who's an international research fellow at the Oxford University Centre for Corporate Reputation and an associate professor at Hazade Business School, and also by today's speaker, Tanusree Jain. Tanusree is an associate professor at the Copenhagen Business School, and her work asks how firms can become responsible global citizens. And in particular, she's interested in the types of governance mechanisms that might encourage responsible firm behavior. She asks how some firms are more responsible than others, and in order to answer that question, she explores how heterogeneous institutional contexts underlying country and regional clusters, such as the Middle East, the European Union, and the emerging economies, encourage and constrain responsible firm behaviours. I'm going to talk briefly about the content of today's presentation in a moment, but first, as usual, I'm going to make a couple of remarks about this seminar series. RETRO stands for Reputation, Ethics, Trust and Relationships at Oxford, and it is an online seminar series that's concerned with the ethical and normative content of trust and reputation in organisational life and with other forms of social evaluation. Retro attracts a wonderfully diverse audience, so thank you for joining us today. And I'd like to thank the people who make Retro possible. So thank you to Rupert Younger, who directs the CCR, to Hannah Morgan, Pippa Smeaton and Mark Hughes Morgan, all of whom do essential backstage work to make the seminars happen. And thank you, of course, to Rita, without whom we wouldn't have these seminars at all. So on to today's seminar. It seems to me quite a good time for the seminar, because right now the news media is full of commentary that equates diversity initiatives with tokenism and concludes from that diversity must be a bad thing. That argument needs a lot more work than I can do in a 2-minute introduction. But one obvious point is that it lacks nuance. So a token, I guess, is a person who's included in a fairly similar group of people in order to give the impression of diversity. And there are reasons to be suspicious of organizations that use tokens as window dressing, but there are also reasons to appreciate organisations that use tokens as agents of change. A woman who's appointed to a formerly all-male board might experience herself as a pathbreaker who can bring her special capabilities to bear on the board's work and who can change entrenched gender attitudes in her company. She might equally feel disempowered and disrespected. So the experience of tokens, to the extent that they exist, matters in very deep ways. And Tanusree is going to help us to understand how that experience works. And I am really looking forward to hearing what she has to say. She's going to speak for about 20 or 30 minutes. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions and comments. Please put them into the Q&A box, and either Rita or I will relay them to Tanusree. We're going to finish promptly at 5 p.m. UK time. Thank you, Tanusree, for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much, Alan and Rita, for the introductions and for allowing me the opportunity to talk about this paper, which unpacks the status of token women in the corporate boardroom. Just to give you, just to set the stage here, that this is a theoretical paper. It's almost framed like a provocation to invite new ideas. But a lot of the content of this particular paper is essentially based and draws a lot from conversations that I've had with both female and male directors across many different countries. For example, India, Ireland, the UK, Spain, and also now in Denmark. So that's where these conversations are coming from, and hopefully they provide a bit more nuance, as you said, Alan, about the status of token women in the corporate boardroom. I'd like to begin my talk by telling you a little bit about what this paper is about. Now, in this paper, we focus on tokenism in the context of gender diversity on corporate boards. Now, we acknowledge that actually there are many kinds of diversities that are equally relevant for corporate boards, such as, for example, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, to name a few, and there are also intersectionalities. But for the purpose of this paper, we focus on gender diversity. Now, we study gender diversity perspective in the corporate boardroom in the world as it is. So we're not making any normative claims in the paper. And it also means that our focus very much lies on the binary classification of gender, because that is what the corporate boardroom even now is talking about. So we're talking about the binary classification of gender as male and female. Although some of the things that we note in this paper might actually be meaningful to non-binary gender identities as well, because they continue to be tokens in the corporate boardroom as well. Now, we study essentially and especially the post-appointment period of the time when the first token woman director is appointed to the corporate boardroom. And essentially, the board culture is one that is determined by men who predominantly are present in the corporate boardroom. And again, the board culture is assumed to be somewhat static, at least in the short run. Although we do not distinguish between the mechanisms through which the woman reaches a corporate boardroom. Now, these could include both soft and hard quotas. It would include impacts of stakeholder and shareholder activism. It could be purely meritorious appointments, meritorious, quote unquote, again, seen in a very gendered way, and of course, through networks. But we do acknowledge that some of these aspects might be relevant to the conversations we provoke, and also that there are indeed individual differences even among token women. In terms of the literature that we are talking about, this paper is fundamentally situated within corporate governance theory. That said, we do acknowledge that at present, most corporate boards continue to mirror the frame of liberal feminism, which is to say that boards are fundamentally male-dominated across the world, and performance of board members and performance of organizations continue to be gendered, where we see the prevalence of masculine norms. Although we've heard a little bit about tokens from Alan, just to give you a sense of, again, what is the definition of tokens here? A token is seen as a member of a minority group who is included in an otherwise homogeneous set of people in order to give an appearance of diversity. Within the context of corporate boards, this means we are talking about women who are tokens and are admitted to membership of corporate boards that are predominantly composed of men, and women are so added in order to provide more representation to this particular gender. In that sense, there are three problematic aspects that happen because of these token appointments, or because of women being identified as tokens of their gender or representatives of their gender. The first thing is that tokens become highly visible, which implies that there's a lot more pressure to their performances. The differences between men and women are obviously extremely observable, and therefore, when you have a token woman in a fundamentally male-dominated boardroom, it accentuates their differences, and these differences can lead to intergroup bias. And again, it also puts pressure on women to act as their gender, and it results in stereotyping and therefore intragroup bias. So these are known, very known problems that arise because of token identification. And from a liberal feminist perspective, the world that we are functioning in right now, these disadvantages can often be overcome by simply increasing the number of women in the corporate boardrooms. That is, by achieving gender-balanced boardrooms, the existing understanding is that we should be in a position to deal with the problems that tokens actually face in a corporate boardroom. Now, what is the existing view of, let's say, women tokens in the literature? The existing view is that token women who are in a minority position, and when we talk about minority position, we are essentially talking about numerical minority. When these token women are present in minority positions in male-dominated contexts, it results, or it's highly likely to result in experiences of tokenism. And this particular aspect that relates tokenism to token status is something that has been studied across different countries, different industries, and different occupations. When we talk about this idea of numerical minority, according to Cantor, this numerical minority happens to be less than 15% representation, but equally there are many different percentages or minority percentages that have been laid out in the literature. Scholars note that sometimes this numerical minority happens to be 17%, other times 20%, 25%. In the corporate governance literature, we generally talk about minority status when women are less than 3 in the corporate board or less than 30% of the entire composition of the corporate board. So the view, of course, is that once this particular numerical minority is surpassed, then women tend to achieve a critical mass on the corporate boardroom. In other words, they have power, they have influence, the presence of women is normalized, and they are likely to have greater impact on both board processes, as well as they are likely to be more positively associated with organizational outcomes. So that's the fundamental view of the women tokens. I will now touch upon some of the problems with the token theory that we raise in this paper. So the first important problem here is that there is fundamentally a monolithic view of tokens that's adopted. In other words, when we talk about a monolithic view, what we are saying is that we are missing out on the breadth of background, personal characteristics, skills, and lived experiences that essentially these individual women or these token women have with them and bring to the corporate boardroom. This becomes extremely relevant in case of boards because board women are not, do not compose, let's say, random members of the population. They are very, very carefully selected from amongst a very small number of people who comprise the labor market of the women who are, basically trying to get these board positions. And the second aspect is that when we talk about the mathematical definition of tokens, it does not talk about relational dynamics that exist between tokens and members of the dominant group. And this is exactly where, these are the relational dynamics are what shapes the experiences of tokenism. So that's a fundamental problem of existing token theory. The second problem that that relates very closely with experiences of tokenism is that we are currently adopting in the literature a reductive logic, which states that tokens are necessarily going to have experiences of tokenism because they are in a minority. In other words, numerical underrepresentation of women is going to be or is an implied signal of lack of power. Now, the other aspect that I will touch upon is a problem with tokenism. That is to say that when female members are tokens, in other words, they are appointed at least partially because of their gender to the corporate boardroom, then they will experience tokenism. But what is missing from the literature is the fact that tokenism is largely an organizational stance that is adopted in response to pressures for inclusion of the corporate board in the corporate board. So essentially, the organizational context is very important and it influences the experiences of tokenism. Having said that, we find very little studies that actually delve into this context within which experiences of tokenism emerge in the corporate boardroom. And that is why we have this fundamental idea about tokens and this monolithic view of tokens in existing literature. So what is it that we do in this particular paper? In this particular paper, what we do is we focus on the dynamics within which women board members navigate their token status, and we do so by integrating two theoretical perspectives. The first one is the identification with women's identification with gender roles within board roles. And the second theoretical perspective that we apply in this paper is the extent to which they are able to socially integrate with the dominant male group. Let me delve with one at a time, one of these. The first one is the identification with gender roles. Here we use the social categorization theory, and according to this particular theory, individuals employ similarities and differences to categorize themselves into groups. When it comes to boards, this means that men are usually characterized and into an in-group because they are dominant, they are within the corporate boards to begin with, and essentially boards are seen as an all-boys club in many countries. And when it comes to women who enter a corporate boardroom that are fundamentally dominated by men, then women comprise an outgroup. Now, categorizations of this in-group and out-group are important because people who comprise the in-group, that is men who comprise the in-group, usually develop less favorable reactions, attitudes, and behaviors towards women who are a part of the out-group. At the same time, there are status differentials that are there between the in-group and the out-group, which is to say that people who are within the in-group generally have a high status as opposed to people who are outside outside this in-group and form the out-group. Now, this leads us to another important theory which is relevant over here, which is self-identification. In other words, once women are placed into this kind of an outgroup, then this subgroup membership is something that also impacts how they view themselves. And that is extremely important in case of token women directors because it plays out in two main ways. One is that token women directors might feel that they do not really want to play out their gender role within the board role simply because it is associated with lower status, simply because it is seen as less powerful, and they have been socialized in a world which is basically this liberal feminist frame where they have learned to play the game which has been set by men and learn to live and play and win that game that is set by men. In other words, the enactment over here is one of a gender-neutral board role, and this is often seen when we hear women say that I prefer to leave my gender at home. On the other hand, there are token women directors who would like to enact their gender role because they feel it is their responsibility to actually infuse more diversity and inclusion at the board level. And oftentimes, this is actually seen in statements such as, it is absolutely our concern that more women are appointed to the board, because if we don't do it, who will? So what we see over here is that the self-identification of women token directors kind of ranges between enactment of a gender role within their board role or enactment of a gender-neutral board role. So that's the first aspect that we think is relevant to providing more nuance to token women directors' experience of tokenism in the corporate boardroom. The second aspect over here deals with social integration with the dominant male group. And here we draw upon the social integration theory, which suggests that the integration of women directors in a male group is going to be complete when they are treated just like the men. So when there is no difference in the treatment between men and women directors. In the case of boards, there are three things that are very important and determine the extent of social integration of women token directors with the dominant male group. The first thing is the prevalent board norms that are there in that particular board. Now, these norms may support or not diversity as well as gender equity and equality. And more important than the board norms is actually this existence of a homosocial environment. Homosocial environment or homosociality essentially, it basically describes social bonds that are created between people of the same gender. In other words, when we talk about competence markers, when we talk about hiring practices, when we talk about communication practices, all of these could be gendered in itself, and they represent the masculine gender in case of homosocial environments that are fundamentally representing environments situated or populated by men. And so this makes a lot of impact on the extent to which women are going to be socially integrated into a dominant male group. The second aspect over here is how the dominant male group evaluates a token woman's qualifications and skills. Now, let me remind you that most of these token women are highly skilled women, highly qualified women, but it's not the objective qualification and skills that really matter, but what sometimes really matters is how they are actually evaluated by the dominant male group. And the extent to how they are evaluated will have an impact on their integration, on their acceptance by the male group. And the third key thing over here is the signaling strategies and the kind of participation tactics that women in a gendered boardroom adopt. And this very much is again, emblematic of essentially the prevalent homosocial masculine culture. That is, women have to, tread a very fine line between appearing warm and also appearing competent at the same time. And there are multiple kind of tactics that women can pragmatically apply in order to feel accepted and socially integrate into the dominant male group. So in effect, what we are saying is that the token woman's experience of tokenism will be contingent on the extent to which a token woman identifies with a female group versus or within this female role within the board role. And secondly, it depends upon the degree to which token women socially integrate with the dominant male group. So what we are essentially looking at is this particular typology. So what we suggest is that, and when we talk about this typology here of women tokens, let me remind you that this is not a very static typology, but highly dynamic. And also this exists within a continuum. So it's possible for women to actually not fit any of these four typologies, but lie somewhere in the middle. So what we are saying is that the interactions of both the integration with the dominant male group as well as identification with the female role within the board role will create a spectrum of organizational circumstances for the token woman. The first kind of circumstance is a token woman becoming paralyzed. And now what is this paralyzed token? We suggest that this paralyzed token is essentially a woman who strongly identifies with a female group. In other words, she wants the group to become, the board to become more inclusive, the board to become more gender diverse. And so she's actively playing that female role within the board role. But she's stuck essentially in a boardroom where the culture is one which hasn't really dealt with the sexist attitudes that are embedded before the token woman was actually integrated or was brought into the corporate boardroom. And so as a result, what happens is that she is not able to successfully integrate in the dominant male group. So her integration is low. At the same time, her identification with the female role happens to be very strong. strong. And when these things happen, she's very frequently dealing with behavior such as eye rolling when she talks about gender issues, and also, for example, when she tries to push for more diversity and inclusion, she's essentially stonewalled and she feels fractured or paralyzed in some sense. And that is our characterization of the paralyzed token. On the other hand, from the paralyzed token, the next classification that I'd like to talk about is a passive token. Now, a passive token is one when a woman token would like to adopt or adopts a more board role and tries to play, her female role in a very, in a very subdued fashion. In other words, she basically, keeps her gender at home, and she solely and wholly acts as a board member in that particular role when she's in the corporate board. However, even with adopting that board role, she's unable to integrate into the dominant male group, and her integration tends to be low. Now, the reason that really happens is because what a female token over here is trying to do is to act like one of the men, in other words, play just the board role. However, because she's seen as a token and as representative of a gender by the male group, she's forcefully categorized into playing the stereotype. When she doesn't want to play the stereotype and acts in her board role, and then what really happens is that she experiences voicelessness, she experiences powerlessness, and therefore she resigns to a more passive status until the time she's able to size up the culture of the board, which happens over a period of time. And therefore, this results in a token becoming passive in the corporate boardroom. And the next time in the next kind of typology that I'd like to talk about is essentially the change maker token and the queen bee token. Now, these are the two characterizations of the token women, where you will find that token women are essentially not powerless, but actually have significant power, have also got a high status, which is where we really depart from extant token theory right now, which says that when women are in a minority, they are necessarily reduced to the experiences of tokenism. Let me take up the queen bee token first. Now, the queen bee token is one who, again, like the passive token, is adopting more of a board role and has a subdued female role that she plays. So in other words, she's becoming just like the men. She wants to demonstrate her capabilities and the experiences and the qualifications which the men basically bring to the boardroom, so to speak. Again, we are looking at the world from the realm or the lens of liberal feminism. In other words, she's able to play the game that the men play and live by the rules of the men in a very, very successful fashion. Now, this particular queen bee is therefore, by virtue of her considerable power, considerable, let's say, personal and professional experiences, is able to, exchange her out-group status and become a part of the in-group. And this usually might happen when such a token has significant experience as an independent director in other boardrooms. And she happens to be the token woman, the first token woman who's introduced to this particular focal boardroom. So ultimately what happens is that she's able to trade her out-group status for an in-group status. She's able to demand respect and command respect from the dominant male group, and she becomes one of them. And ultimately, what really happens as a result of her acquiring this status is that the general standards for any other woman to follow are exceptionally high, and therefore she becomes the benchmark of the kind of women we'd like to see in the corporate boardroom. Fundamentally, what this particular token woman is doing in terms of acting as a queen bee is simply in response to the masculine culture that is prevalent in corporate boardrooms, or it's in response to the inequalities that result or that are prevalent in corporate boardrooms. The next kind of characterization is one of a change maker token. Now, the change maker token is essentially one who is similar to the paralyzed token in the sense that she identifies strongly with her female role within the board role. So she takes upon herself a responsibility to, play the diversity token in the sense that let's promote diversity, let's make boards more inclusive. And at the same time, similar to the queen bee, she has significant experience in the independent boards in other companies. And as a result of that, she's able to achieve integration within the dominant male group in her particular board. But what is also really important to note over here is that most of the times, some change maker tokens are able to play that particular role of change makers, because even if these particular boardrooms are fundamentally male driven, they are more accepting of diversity. They are more open to diversity. And because of that, she is not paralyzed. She's still able to play the female role. She's still able to integrate within the dominant male group. And she's able to bring about, let's say, more women into the corporate boardroom from the pipeline. And that is when, change really starts within the corporate boardroom. So what we show through our characterization is that the same token woman who is the only woman on a corporate boardroom could actually have different impact on a corporate boardroom depending upon how she identifies with her female role within the board role, but more importantly, the extent to which she's able to merge and integrate into the dominant male group, which fundamentally depends upon the culture and the context of the organizations that she's dealing with. Through this particular typology, we try to make two key contributions. The first contribution that we are trying to make is to really advocate for a refined usage of the term token. When we look at the management literature, and even in my conversations with practitioners, the token designation is usually used in a very restricted fashion. It is usually seen as derogatory. Women do not want to be called a token woman. But that is probably because most of the time, when we talk about tokens, we are largely talking about the circumstances within which an appointment of a woman is made to a corporate boardroom. Whereas actually what we should be looking at is what happens in the post-appointment stage of a woman token. So what is her experience in the corporate boardroom, and then what is the impact she's likely to have on the corporate boardroom in terms of practices, in terms of processes. And therefore, it is important for us to refine our usage of token when we look at corporate boardrooms. And the second and more related aspect is that it is very important to make a distinction between tokens and experiences of tokenism. A lot of the literature uses them in a way that that whenever a woman is going to be a token, she's necessarily going to become or experience tokenism. In other words, unless and until we have a critical mass, these experiences of tokenism are warranted. They will not go away. Whereas what we are trying to say here is that we need a more nuanced understanding of the different categories of token appointments, of the different kinds of effects that organizations can have on tokens, and also the effect that tokens can have on organizations, including on goals such as gender equality. In other words, what we are trying to say is that not all token women should experience negative outcomes in the form of tokenism if organizational context and if board cultures are amenable to diversity and inclusion of women on the corporate board. So with that, I'd like to end my talk here, and I'd be very happy to take more questions. Thank you.
Thank you. That was fantastic. There was an awful lot going on, and therefore I have an awful lot of quite stupid questions. Can I encourage our audience to put their questions in the Q&A box? I have plenty of stupid questions, but I appreciate that other people probably have clever ones. I have a question about, I know this isn't intended to be a normative paper, but I have a question about norms that I think were implicit in what you were talking about. And in particular, you kept talking about the liberal feminist frame as if it's something that we should not approve of. And if you'd asked me at 5-4 how I felt about the liberal feminist frame, I'd have said I was 100% behind it. So I just wonder if you could explain to me, am I right in thinking that you think that this is a framing that's unhelpful, or that it captures or doesn't quite get at something that matters? And if I am right that you think that, is there a normative, is there a suggestion of how we ought to behave lurking in the background of your presentation?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the things about I'd like to say that I'm fundamentally a corporate governance scholar, and so I don't really know a lot about feminist scholarship. It was actually through one of our through many revise and review requests where we were pushed to basically talk about feminism that I started exploring this literature. And when I started doing so, it actually in many ways it made me rethink the way I also think about my own role as a woman, and that helped me connect better with how we look at and how we expect women on corporate boardrooms to behave, and and what we look at in terms of competences, what we look at in terms of hiring women, expecting them to work a certain hours, and so on and so forth. So when I talk about the liberal feminism frame, what I'm talking about and what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong there, is that it basically talks about the fact that women are fundamentally living in a man's world. When it comes to the corporate boardroom, we are playing by the men's rules of the game, so to speak, which is essentially that we are looking for causality, all this talk about causality, that the moment you add more women on the boards, somehow it should result in fundamental differences on organizational behaviors or organizational performance, and that diversity for the sake of diversity somehow is a wrong thing to do. And so therefore, when I started understanding this particular frame, it really made me question the fact that we work extremely long hours. We are, even as academics, trying to achieve the same standards of performance that a man has to do, despite the fact that, we look at what is academia, for example, and what is our responsibility in different ways. In the same way, when we look at women on the boardroom, the kind of competencies that they bring into the corporate boardroom would be very different from the kind of competencies that men bring to the corporate boardroom, but somehow they are evaluated by the same frame as men. So when I look at that, then yes, I do look at liberal feminism from a critical perspective to say that simply adding more women to a corporate boardroom when the culture of the corporate boardroom and of the organization is fundamentally against or not in favor of accepting their differences, is that really going to make a difference? And then the fact of the matter being that if we do have more inclusive organizations in terms of culture that appreciate these differences and appreciate the different kind of competencies that women bring to the corporate boardroom, then in that case, even a single woman should be able to bring change in the organization like we would expect them.
I have so many follow-up questions. I'm not allowed to dominate the seminar, so I can turn over to Rita.
Thank you so much. This is absolutely fascinating. And I also have way too many questions. So I think a couple of them are more like clarification questions. So maybe I'll lead with a couple of these because I'm expecting them to be quite quick. But okay. So the first one is about the changemaker token. I was a bit puzzled as to why you characterized it as changemaker, because this woman sounded to me like she was walking into an environment where there's already quite a robust structure for diversity and inclusion. And so I'm not quite sure where the change element of changemaker comes from, because isn't she just fitting in to an environment that's already ideal or close to ideal? And then the second question that I think is related has to do with intersectionality. So I was wondering to what extent some of these women might be more on one or other side of your matrix, depending on characteristics that are quite independent from gender, but that make them, for example, more likely to be seen as having an in-group status than otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for the question, Rita. The first one, so in the first case, why we call her the change maker, and that's because this is fundamentally a male dominated boardroom, and she is the first token woman to actually be appointed to the board. Now, there are studies, for example, that have been done in the Swedish context, contexts which are considered to be more egalitarian, and also where essentially there's a prevalence of more women in the corporate boardroom. Even in these kind of cultures, where you could say that it's a perfect recipe for many women to get into the corporate boardroom, or for that matter, for the environment in that particular board to be more diverse and more supportive of diversity and inclusion. Even in these kind of boardrooms, what has been seen is that homosociality happens to be affected in a very unreflexive fashion. So when it comes to actually hiring of managing directors or CEOs in these boardrooms, despite the fact that they are more open to inclusivity, you still find that the kind of hiring practices and the kind of competencies they actually mark, they are still hiring more men than women. So that is why you do need so when a woman comes into a corporate boardroom that is more inclusive, that is more open to inclusivity, but it's still dominated by men, she can actually shift those unreflexive practices to becoming more reflexive, to become more thoughtful, and therefore she can shift this masculine culture to becoming more, let's say, less homosocial. And that is why she's the change maker, because those kind of change makers are necessary to change this culture of unreflexive homosociality that is seen in research. That's the one thing why we call her the change maker, right? That we still need that change to happen. In case of the second one, I totally agree with you that yes, indeed, if you actually look at white women, for example, they would probably have more likely might get an in-group status than, for example, a Black woman in the case of the US. So yes, intersectionality would perhaps matter in some significant ways, but the reason we stay away from that in this paper is just to make it simpler for us to deal with all the other dynamics that we are dealing with right now to categorize the women. But that certainly is the next step to consider, that intersectionality might make it easier for some and make it more difficult for others and more maybe the outgroup status would be more, let's say, sustained for certain kind of people and certain kind of women as opposed to others.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I have a million other questions like Ellen, but I'll give my turn.
Okay, so one of my other questions overlaps with two questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to combine them. So I was surprised at your use of the term queen bee in your typology. I worked a long time ago in a former life in an almost entirely male dealing room in the city. So there were 78 men or 2 women in that room. And some of my unenlightened colleagues used the word queen bee in a very pejorative fashion, refer to one of the other 2 women. It's a word that to me has negative connotations, and it feels like the sort of word that a dinosaur male would use. So I have 2 questions about queen bee, and they overlap with the 2 questions in the Q&A. So one is Robert Mass, who points out that you're using a term that most people would view as very pejorative. So he wants to know if you're saying that someone who integrates fully onto a board and focuses on traditionally male area, like, I don't know, financial risk management, instead of an area that is, rather trivially sometimes gendered, like employee engagement towards women. Is the suggestion that there's something wrong with this behavior? And if there isn't, maybe a different term would work. And even if there isn't something wrong, I wonder if that term captures our common usage. And a related question from Julian Friedland. He wants to know whether the queen bee token tends to embrace, negate, or transcend her female status in the role. And he wants to know whether any of those is either a good or a bad thing. So again, people are, as I am, kind of interested in what your normative conclusions are. So there's a lot of questions there. Pick the ones you want to
answer. Yes, indeed. I mean, I think we've thought a lot about the use of the queen bee. But like I said, that a lot of these ideas come from my conversations with female and male directors. And so actually, queen bee is something that a lot of female directors have noted in their conversations to me. And they absolutely say that queen bees exist in the corporate boardroom. Now, who is a queen bee? And if I were to make a qualitative judgment about the queen bee, well, the queen bee is just somebody who has, who is extremely successful in a male-dominated boardroom. So in that sense, she occupies the position of a classic queen bee, as in natural sciences, for example. But then what really happens in this kind of a boardroom is that because she has played her board role, she is extremely successful in, quote unquote, the gendered way. And then she gets placed into important committees, like you said, like, audit committee or remuneration committee and so on, and no longer on toothless committee, so to speak, like CSR or employee well-being and so on. Then that becomes the minimum benchmark for most women in those kind of boards to gain entry. So that benchmark is so high that inadvertently it becomes sort of a gatekeeping exercise, or she occupies a gatekeeper's role, which was previously occupied by her male colleagues. Now, she might have adopted a queen bee sort of a role because it was in response to what she's aware of the inequalities that exist. She knows that playing the gender role is not going to get her anywhere, and therefore she's more agentic in terms of deciding for herself to play more of the board role and to kind of board role and to curb the female role that she could have adopted, and becomes the queen bee. And I think that that's simply an agentic, that's simply her agency in that case, in order to deal with the attitudes that she has encountered, perhaps potentially in her prior career. So we don't really look at queen bee in a derogatory fashion, in a pejorative way, but what we are trying to say is that simply this is a classification in which a woman token is able to display significant power, in which she is a part of the in-group, and she no longer has or experiences tokenism in the classic way. So that's basically the perspective that we come from. If you think that there is a better way to classify that, I'd love to hear from you, because we've really struggled to come up with a metaphor that captures this particular behavior of a token woman.
I'll think about that. Rita.
There's an interesting question here from Nishat about some of the assumptions that you are at least apparently making about the male part of the board, and particularly with regard to potentially an excessively homogeneous quality to the existing members. And so Nishat is asking, maybe could there maybe be something to be said about some people in these boards in the dominant group that might act as gatekeepers, perhaps others who are available to support in some other way. And there's also a question about the characteristics of this male group that could either facilitate or hinder the integration of token women. And I think this is related to a question that I had, so I'm just going to take advantage of it and sneak it in. Because I was wondering about other aspects that could shape the experience of tokenism that could go beyond these two axes that you're looking at. I was thinking, for example, for your change makers, right? There's this very high integration. Okay, I get that, but maybe there's an extremely high burden of invisible work in terms of mentoring more junior women, or some other aspects that are not captured by these two variables, and that might make it so that a woman has a more or less negative or positive experience of being the only woman on that board. So I guess this is probably related. I don't know. Again, like Alan said, you pick the questions you want to answer.
Yes, I do agree with that. I think that obviously this is a very simplistic view of the corporate boardroom. And then there are men who could become champions of diversity. There are men who could, very well be the men who bring this token woman into the boardroom for the first time, even in contexts where there are no quotas, right? And in which there is no expectation of women being appointed, but there could be men who could be doing that. As a matter of fact, in one of the conversations that I had with, the CEO of Biocon, which is a $1 billion organization listed on the stock exchange, it's a pharmaceutical company, and I was having this conversation with the CEO of the company, who for the first time became the independent director of Infosys, which is a huge IT company, and it was actually the managing director of Infosys who brought her to the corporate boardroom for the first time. So absolutely, there are men who are champions of diversity, who support diversity, and probably these are probably the men, or these are the kind of men that enable cultures, that enable women tokens to become change makers. And so again, going back to this example, when she was the first woman director, brought in several other women into the Infosys boardroom, and that became a highly diverse corporate boardroom to begin with. So yes, indeed, there are, the roles that men have to play. On the other hand, there is also, a view of men where we find that women are often, over-mentored and under-sponsored. So in other words, there are patriarchal attitudes that men would adopt to hand-hold women and introduce them to how the boards run, even when the woman is equally qualified or more qualified than them and has a lot of experience. And in that case, even though they are mentored into this role, they are not really, they're not really sponsored the sense that when it comes to taking up CSR committees, she's the one who gets the work, and she doesn't get an important position. So I think the men do have a very important role to play, and that's one of the managerial implications that we say in this paper, is that it's not only up to the women, and it should not be the onus on women to integrate into the boardroom, but a lot of this integration, a lot of these appointing and hiring policies are actually framed by men, and they can actually play a huge role in allowing women to become, in not just allowing, but creating conditions that make women the change maker in corporate boardrooms, as opposed to passive or as opposed to paralyzed. Yeah.
Alan?
Okay, I'm just going to keep cherry picking normative questions from the Q&A. I'm still confused by your attitude towards liberal feminism, which I would not characterize as you do. And I want to know, and Holger Blenska also wants to know, whether your attitude leads you to believe that quotas for women on boards is a good idea or a bad idea. It almost sounds like you don't like them. Is that right?
No, that is not right. What I'm trying to say is that quotas in case of a corporate setting, if you have quotas, but if you do not work on the culture of the boardroom, then they're not going to work. And so that's basically what I'm trying to say. And
so
at the same time,
if I have an all-male board and I immediately fire half the directors and replace them with women, won't the culture change?
It would most definitely change.
So arguing that I can't favor quotas when the culture's wrong is backwards. Quotas change culture.
So when it comes to quotas, right? I mean, the quotas usually, first of all, in case of India, for example, I'll give you an example of quotas. There is a quota right now, quota law or regulation that has been introduced that says that you can introduce, according to the quota, one woman director on a corporate boardroom. Now, how many boards actually go ahead and exceed quota regulations? Not too many. As a matter of fact, if you look at the case of Sweden, so many companies actually chose to take their companies private so that they could get over the quota regulation, which was like 40% quotas in case of Swedish companies.
Okay, that's an argument that not using quotas doesn't change culture because people avoid them. So the Norwegian quota is 40%.
Yeah, sorry,
that changes culture? So perhaps in 2008, before the quota came in Norway, there was a very masculine culture on boards. Surely it changed pretty rapidly when the boards became more diverse.
Yes, but how many countries have been able to enforce 40% quota?
Quite a lot. And within the European Union, the quotas are going down to the MSCI board diversity data. I mean, so your argument is therefore not that quotas are a bad thing, but that quotas are unenforceable. I'm still trying to understand where you stand on these.
I'm trying to say that quotas by themselves are not going to solve a problem unless quotas result in significantly changing the dynamics or the composition of the boardroom. So if you introduce one woman, for example, as a quota entry, what is important to see is who is that particular woman. Many times, for example, companies use quotas in order to get, for example, the wife of the CEO on the corporate board. How is that going to result into a change in the corporate culture is a question. In case of family boards, a lot of the females get entry into the corporate boardroom without requisite experience. The right women do not get a chance to get into the corporate boardroom because there's a way of introducing quotas in different institutional contexts. That is one. The second thing is that there are turnarounds or there are ways around the quota regulation. I'm absolutely not against quota. What I'm trying to say is that unless we have quotas that will substantially change the composition of the boardroom, they are likely to be utilized in different ways by companies that may not always work. What I'm also trying to say is that assuming that there is only going to be one woman and that she's going to be necessarily reduced to tokenism is a wrong argument to make, which is to say that even a token woman can make significant changes in a corporate boardroom and its culture, if the culture of the room that is more amenable to change, if it is more inclusive. And so the responsibility over here is not just about regulations. The responsibility here rests with both the men and the women on the corporate boardroom, right? To allow for the integration, to allow or create circumstances that make inclusion possible in the real sense.
Okay, we could go on for some time here, but I'm going to let Rita have a go.
Thank you. We have a question from Sahar Ahmad that I think is very interesting. So basically, it's about the possibility of exporting your framework to other contexts that are not just necessarily the boardroom. For example, would you still think along the same lines, if we were talking about other male-dominated groups inside business organizations, like, for example, finance, M&A functions that tend to be very male-heavy, according to Sahar. What do you think?
I'm not sure, but I think it's certainly worth a thought whether this framework could be transported in other situations. I do think to a certain extent it works in academia, for example. And I've thought a lot about some of these categories, particularly the changemaker token. I've noted that when in academia and when we have departments that are headed by women, for example, we fundamentally see more women getting more meatier roles in terms of committee leadership as opposed to otherwise. So I certainly see that when the culture happens to be more inclusive, then even a single woman that is introduced or that is hired, you will see how she starts getting more important roles, and that allows other women to see that as a role model and then follow her lead, for example. So I do think that there are certain contexts where this work. I'm not entirely sure about M&A because I haven't thought about it, but that's a good point, and I'm going to certainly note it.
Alan, I think you have time for another question.
Okay. I want to talk about the sort of theory that you're doing. So I'm going to ask you the Karl Popper question, and it sort of relates to a question that Ruth has put into the chat too. So I want to know how I would falsify your theory. So I mean, it might be that your theory is not intended to be falsified. It might be that your theory is intended to give us better language to talk about important phenomena, which would be perfectly reasonable. So is that what it is, or is it something that in theory one, it makes predictions, or it makes us, it gives us causality relationships. And if it does give us causality relationships, Ruth raises an interesting endogeneity question. Is the queen bee what she is because of her characteristics, or because the characteristics of the board culture around her? And I guess that's the sort of thing that falsifiability criteria are going to run up against. So have you thought about this question?
Yes, I have indeed. I think the purpose of having this particular typology was that, first of all, it is not static. It is dynamic, and it is something that exists in the post-appointment period, which is to say that the time when a token woman enters a corporate boardroom and the culture is somewhat static, these are some of the some of the roles that she might actually fall into, or some of the roles that she might adopt while she's getting used to the corporate culture, or while the corporate culture in itself evolves over a period of time. So the idea behind this was to capture that particular short-term frame during the post-appointment period. What we note here is that for example, oftentimes when women enter a certain setting where they, face a lot of opposition, they might want to become passive for a while before they, size the culture, try to understand what's going on, and then strategically decide what their actions are likely to be. Now, this has been captured by interviews that people have done talking to women directors, and they constantly talk about how we keep quiet, how we keep silent, how we push. So there are multiple strategies that they adopt while they're getting used to the corporate boardroom. So one of the reasons for adopting this particular typology, or to coming up with this typology, was not really to test this theory in a way, or falsify this theory, but to kind of think about strategies and pragmatic approaches that women directors could adopt during or after the post-appointment period in order to try to find their way, in order to become more, in order to assimilate into the corporate boardroom, which is often a challenge. So that was really the purpose of this particular framework, was to start thinking about strategies that one could adopt. And the reason I started thinking about that is that I've discussed this framework with a lot of women directors, independent women directors, and they often say, "Oh yes, I have experienced that, and I have felt that." So in my view, this is not a classic theorization that is going to be tested and so on, but it is a theorization that allows us to strategize the different, let's say, the armor that women on boards can go with when it comes to maneuvering their way within a corporate boardroom. That was really the purpose of this framework.
Okay, thank you. Peter, do you think we've got time for a quick one?
Maybe. Okay. Let me
Really
try to
quick.
pick up a brief one. So if I understand Carlos Estevez Mendoza's question correctly, I think this could be quite brief because I think it relates to the business case for enabling change makers in some way. So Carlos is asking if you think that the change maker role can anticipate the effects of critical mass, and so maybe speed up the process of reaching it. And he suggests, to put it directly, that he thinks that women on board change the board capital since they joined for the better. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, I think I would agree with that. And that's precisely why there would be a push for bringing more women into the corporate boardroom, because yes, it does fundamentally change cultures. So in that sense, more achieving a critical mass, but I wouldn't like to call it a critical mass, but achieving or having more women on boards, for example, is likely to impact fundamentally the culture within a boardroom. So absolutely, I agree with that. And the change maker token would certainly be in the position to do so more easily and faster than the others, precisely because the culture of the room is such that it is more open to accepting. In my conversations with women who were, kind of paralyzed or in many ways passive, or became passive or forced to become passive, one of the things that they said was that they really try to push for, bringing more diversity in, and they were often stonewalled and they were often blocked, and they were, the idea was, okay, let's just move on to the next agenda because we've had enough of this. So clearly, I think that I would agree with him in terms of the benefits of having more women on boards is something that a change maker token would be in a position to, not just like the paralyzed token, not just understand that, but actually be able to implement that on a corporate boardroom. So I think the paralyzed token also understands that, but is unable to actually do so because of the nature of the boardroom.
I might just ask a very brief follow-up question. I think
yes,
this
you can do it in 2 minutes, Gita.
I know, don't put pressure on me. We're wasting time. So, and I forgot what I was going to say. Anyway, I think we'll just leave it here then. I'll ask you the question when it comes back to me. Thank you so much, Alan.
Yeah, we have quite a few unanswered questions on the Q&A. You will say if you ask one of those questions, we will forward all of them to Tanusree, so they will be read. Thank you for a fantastic hour, Tanusree. It's really been very interesting. As you could probably tell, I have quite a lot of extra questions, so definitely sparked some interesting thoughts and conversations. And thank you. Thank you everyone for coming. This is the last seminar of this term. We'll be back after the Easter break, and we will email you with details of the new program for the spring term. Okay, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.